The rain fell in relentless sheets over Seattle, Washington, on a bitter November night, transforming the city's glittering skyline into a blur of trembling lights. The wind howled through the streets of Queen Anne, a neighborhood where sprawling mansions sat like silent monarchs, their windows glowing faintly against the storm. In the alleys below, where the wealthy rarely ventured, the rain was not just weather, it was a cruel adversary soaking through thin clothes and chilling bones to the marrow. Lily Harper, a girl of 8, ran through these alleys, her bare feet slapping against the flooded pavement, her breaths coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Her thin frame shivered beneath a tattered dress soaked to transparency, clinging to her skin like a second layer of despair. In her arms, she clutched a ragged teddy bear, its fur matted, and one eye missing a relic from a life she could barely recall. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating her face for a fleeting moment. Wide brown eyes filled with fear, cheeks streaked with rain and dirt, and dark hair plastered to her forehead. She didn't know where she was running, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her, earlier that evening, the shouts of men had echoed through the streets near Pike Place Market, their voices rough and menacing, calling her name as if it were a curse. They had chased her for blocks, their heavy footsteps pounding closer until she'd slipped through a narrow gap between buildings, losing them in the maze of the city. Now the men were gone, but the storm was not. It pursued her with a ferocity that seemed personal, as if the world itself wanted to swallow her whole. Lily's legs burned, her small body trembling with exhaustion and cold. She had learned long ago that hunger and fear could make the world a merciless place. Orphaned at 4, she had bounced between foster homes and a grim orphanage in Tacoma, where kindness was scarce and cruelty was currency. She had fled that place 3 weeks ago, choosing the uncertainty of the streets over the certainty of harm. Her only companion was the teddy bear, which she called Mr. Paws, a name whispered in secret moments when she dared to dream of something softer than the life she knew. Tonight, though, dreams were far away. The rain stung her eyes, and the wind tore at her, pushing her toward the hill where Queen Anne's grandest homes stood. She didn't know why she climbed the steep streets, only that the lights up there promised something, maybe shelter, maybe safety, maybe just a moment to breathe. Her feet slipped on wet cobblestones, but she pressed on, driven by a stubborn spark that refused to let her give up. At the top of the hill, the Caldwell estate loomed like a fortress of glass and steel, its sleek lines cutting through the storm's chaos. The mansion's walls glowed under security lights, reflecting off the manicured hedges that lined its perimeter. To most, it was a symbol of untouchable wealth, a testament to the success of Ethan Caldwell, a 42-year-old tech mogul whose name was synonymous with innovation and power. To Lily, it was a beacon in the dark, the only place that looked like it could stand against the storm. She squeezed through a gap in the wrought iron fence, her arms scraping against the cold metal, and stumbled into the garden, where roses bowed under the weight of the rain. Her breath fogged in the chilled air as she crouched behind a bush, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might betray her. She hugged Mr. Paws tighter, whispering to him, "We're okay, just for a little while." She might have stayed there hidden and shivering until dawn, if not for the low hum of an engine approaching the driveway. A sleek black Tesla, its surface gleaming even in the downpour, rolled toward the garage. Inside, Ethan Caldwell gripped the steering wheel with the calm precision of a man who had mastered control. At 42, he was a titan in the tech world, his company's algorithms powering half the internet's infrastructure. His name commanded boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Shanghai. Yet he lived alone in this palace of glass, surrounded by staff who moved like ghosts and left before dusk. Success had given him everything, wealth, influence, a house that architects envied. But it had not filled the void he never spoke of. As the car stopped, he stepped out, adjusting his tailored coat against the rain, his mind already on the emails awaiting him, the deals to be closed in Tokyo by morning. But then, a small voice pierced the storm, fragile yet clear, like a bell ringing through fog. "Sir, please can I sleep in your garage tonight? I won't touch anything." Ethan froze, his keys dangling in his hand. For a moment, he thought the wind was playing tricks, but then he turned his eyes, scanning the dim driveway until they found her. A tiny figure stood just beyond the car's headlights, soaked to the bone, her dress clinging to her trembling frame. Her lips quivered as she spoke, her eyes wide, with a mix of desperation and fear. "I'll be quiet," she added quickly, as if expecting anger just until the rain stops. Ethan blinked, utterly unprepared. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, faced down ruthless competitors, but this, a child no taller than his waist, left him speechless. He had no garage clutter, no old boxes or junk for anyone to hide in. His life was meticulously ordered, free of mess or unpredictability. But the girl didn't know that. To her, even a corner of his garage was a palace compared to the streets. He stared at her longer than he meant to, his mind flashing to a memory he kept buried. A little girl, his younger sister Emily, laughing in a park decades ago before the accident that took her at 9. The image hit him like a fist, sharp and unexpected. This child, this Lily, was about the same age, her eyes carrying a weight no child should bear. The storm seemed to fade for a moment, the world narrowing to the space between them. "You can't stay out here," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. The girl's gaze dropped to the puddles at her feet, her shoulders hunching. "I can sleep in the garden. I won't make a mess." The words twisted something inside Ethan, an ache he didn't recognize. "What's your name?" he asked, softer now. "Lily," she whispered, barely audible over the rain. "Lily Harper." He crouched to meet her eyes, noticing the scratches on her arms, the mud caked on her small hands, and a faint scar snaking across her wrist, thin but jagged, like a story she wasn't ready to tell. Her eyes were dark, filled with fear, but also a flicker of hope that seemed too heavy for her small frame. "Lily," he repeated, testing the name. "You can't sleep outside. Come in, at least until you're warm." Her eyes widened, disbelief flickering across her face. "Inside?" she asked, as if the word were foreign. "Yes, inside," he said, opening the heavy glass door of the mansion, its lights spilling onto the wet stone steps. For years, that door had opened only for business partners, investors, or the occasional acquaintance, all part of Ethan's carefully curated world. Now it stood open for a child who had asked for nothing more than a corner to hide in. Lily hesitated, glancing at her dripping clothes, then at him. "I'll get everything dirty," she murmured. "Floors can be cleaned," Ethan replied, and for the first time in years he felt the weight of his own words. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped across the threshold, her bare feet leaving faint wet prints on the polished concrete floor. Each step seemed to carry a quiet defiance, as if she were claiming a space she'd never been allowed to occupy. She lifted her gaze to the soaring atrium, where a chandelier of reclaimed wood and steel hung like a constellation. Her mouth parted in awe, but she said nothing, clutching Mr. Paws tighter. Ethan closed the door behind her, the storm's roar muted by thick walls. "My name's Ethan," he said, his voice gentler than he intended. "You're safe here tonight." Lily nodded, her wet hair clinging to her cheeks, but her silence spoke louder than words. She didn't trust yet, and why should she? The world had taught her to expect rejection. But in that silence, Ethan felt a weight settle on his shoulders, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. He led her through the house, past walls of glass that framed the stormy Puget Sound, past sculptures and minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's homes. Lily's eyes darted everywhere, taking it all in, her small hand brushing the smooth surface of a hallway table as if to confirm it was real. He opened the door to a guest bathroom where slate tiles stretched to a ceiling embedded with soft lights. Turning on the faucet, he watched as steam rose from the clawfoot tub, filling the room with warmth. Lily stood at the threshold, frozen. Her eyes fixed on the water. Warm water, she whispered, as if it were a secret she wasn't meant to know. Ethan grabbed a stack of plush towels from a cabinet and set them by the tub. "It's for you," he said simply. Her lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might cry. "For me?" she asked, her voice small. He nodded. "Take a bath. It'll help you warm up." He stepped out, leaving the door ajar so she wouldn't feel trapped, and stood in the hallway, his mind racing. The image of her, her fingers reaching for the steam, stayed with him, stirring something he couldn't name. When Lily emerged, wrapped in a towel that dwarfed her, her hair fell in damp waves, and her cheeks glowed with a flush of warmth. She looked transformed, but her eyes still held a wary edge, as if waiting for the moment she'd be asked to leave. Ethan handed her one of his old t-shirts, a plain gray one that reached her knees. She smoothed it carefully, as if it were a treasure. "You must be hungry," he said, leading her to the kitchen. The space was a chef's dream, stainless steel and marble, stocked with gourmet ingredients he rarely touched. He bypassed the truffle oil and imported cheeses, opting instead for simplicity, a grilled cheese sandwich, golden and crisp, and a glass of warm milk. Lily sat at the counter, her legs swinging, not quite reaching the floor. She held the sandwich with both hands, taking small, careful bites, her eyes closing with each one. When she thought he wasn't looking, she slipped half a sandwich into the pocket of the t-shirt, a habit born of survival. Ethan pretended not to notice, but the sight tightened his chest, a child so young already preparing for the next time hunger would strike. As her eyelids grew heavy, Lily's voice broke the silence. "Can I sleep on the couch? I won't mess it up." The question hit Ethan harder than he expected. She was asking permission to exist, to take up space in a world that had offered her none. "You'll sleep in a bed?" he said, his tone firm but kind. Her eyes widened as if he'd offered her the moon. He led her to a guest room where a king-sized bed draped in white linen seemed to swallow the room's vastness. Lily stood at the doorway, clutching Mr. Paws, staring at the bed as if it were a dream she didn't trust. "It's too big," she whispered. "It's yours tonight," Ethan replied, adjusting the pillows with an awkwardness that betrayed how long it had been since he'd cared for anyone. She climbed in, disappearing into the blankets, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. As he turned off the light, leaving a small lamp glowing, her voice floated from the dark. "Thank you, Mr. Ethan." The words, soft and sincere, struck him deeper than any boardroom victory. He closed the door, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. That night, Ethan sat in his study, surrounded by screens and reports, but his mind was elsewhere. The girl sleeping down the hall had upended something in him. It wasn't just pity, it was heavier, more personal. He thought of Emily, of the sister he'd lost, of the guilt he'd carried for decades. Lily's presence felt like a second chance, though he didn't know for what. Outside the storm raged on, but inside a fragile calm took root, one neither he nor Lily fully understood. The mansion, once a monument to his solitude, felt different now, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Ethan didn't know why this moment mattered so much, but he knew his life had shifted, as surely as the tides crashing against Seattle's shores. And in that shift, He sensed the beginning of something he hadn't dared hope for, a connection that might fill the emptiness he'd built his empire to ignore. A week had passed since the storm that brought Lily Harper to Ethan Caldwell's doorstep, but the echoes of that night lingered in the air of his Seattle mansion. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, cloaking Queen Anne in a gray mist that blurred the edges of the city's skyline. Inside the sleek glass-walled estate, the silence that once defined Ethan's life was no longer absolute. It was interrupted by small sounds, a child's footsteps padding across the polished concrete, the faint rustle of pages turning the soft hum of a lullaby. Lily sang to her teddy bear, Mr. Paws, when she thought no one was listening. Ethan, a 42-year-old tech mogul whose world had been built on precision and control, found himself adjusting to these new rhythms, each one a reminder of the girl who had asked for nothing more than a corner of his garage. Lily, now 8 years old, wore his oversized T-shirts like dresses, her dark hair often tied back with a ribbon she'd found in a guest room drawer. Her presence was a quiet disruption, a crack in the fortress of his solitude, and though he couldn't name the feeling, it stirred memories he'd long buried, memories of his sister Emily, of laughter cut short of a guilt that had shaped his life more than he'd ever admitted. Ethan sat in his study, the glow of multiple screens casting shadows across his face. He was supposed to be reviewing code for his company's next algorithm update, but his attention kept drifting to the hallway where Lily's voice floated faintly, reading aloud to Mr. Paws from a book she'd pulled from his library. It was a worn copy of Charlotte's Web, one of the few non-technical books in the house left behind by a designer who'd staged the mansion years ago. Her voice, clear and deliberate, despite her hesitations over bigger words, tugged at something deep in Ethan's chest. He'd given her permission to stay temporarily, telling himself it was just until he could sort out what to do next, but each day made that decision harder to define. He'd contacted Rachel Nguyen, a social worker recommended by a colleague, to look into Lily's background. Rachel, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, had arrived the previous day, her clipboard and questions filling the room with an air of officialdom that made Lily shrink into the couch. Rachel's findings were sparse, but grim. Lily had been in and out of foster care since she was 4, her parents lost to a car accident she barely remembered. Her last stop was an orphanage in Tacoma, a place Rachel described as underfunded and overstretched with whispers of neglect and worse. Lily had run away 3 weeks ago, surviving on scraps and her own wits. "She's a survivor," Rachel had said, her voice heavy with admiration and sorrow. "But she's carrying trauma. You can see it in how she flinches at loud noises, how she hides food." Ethan had nodded, his jaw tight, remembering the half sandwich Lily had tucked into her pocket that first night. He'd asked Rachel to keep digging to find out if anyone was looking for her, though a part of him dreaded the answer. The thought of sending her back to a system that had failed her felt like a betrayal, yet keeping her here in a world he barely understood himself seemed reckless. Lily, for her part, moved through the mansion like a ghost, learning to be human again. She was careful, almost too careful, as if afraid her presence would wear out its welcome. She folded her blankets each morning, wiped down surfaces after touching them, and apologized for things that didn't need apologies. But there were moments when her guard slipped, when she laughed at a cartoon playing on Ethan's tablet, or when she traced the patterns of the constellation-like chandelier with wide, wondering eyes. Ethan watched these moments, each one a small victory over the fear that clung to her. He'd started leaving out books, simple puzzles, even an old laptop he no longer used, curious to see what she'd do. To his surprise, Lily gravitated toward the laptop, her small fingers tapping hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. She'd found a basic coding game pre-installed, and within days she was solving puzzles Ethan hadn't touched since his college days. "You're good at this," he'd said one evening, watching her debug a simple sequence. She'd blushed, ducking her head, but her eyes had sparkled with something like pride. Yet the shadows of Lily's past were never far behind. At night she woke screaming, her cries muffled into her pillow, as if she'd learned to hide her fear, even in sleep. Ethan, alerted by the sound, would find her curled tightly around Mr. Paws, her face wet with tears. "They're coming," she'd whisper sometimes, her voice trembling with a terror that made Ethan's stomach twist. Who, he'd ask, but she'd only shake her head, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting someone to break through. He began to suspect those men from the night she'd arrived, the ones whose shouts had chased her through Seattle's streets, were more than just a fleeting threat. He'd doubled the security around the estate, installing cameras and reinforcing the gates, but the unease in Lily's eyes told him it wasn't enough. One gray afternoon, Ethan decided to take Lily to a nearby park, hoping fresh air might ease the tension that seemed to coil tighter with each passing day. The park, nestled between Queen Anne's mansions and the city's edge, was quiet, its swings swaying gently in the drizzle. Lily, bundled in one of Ethan's old jackets, clutched his hand as they walked, her eyes scanning the trees. She seemed lighter here, chasing a stray leaf or giggling when a squirrel darted past, but Ethan noticed how she stayed close, never straying more than a few steps. They sat on a bench, sharing a bag of pretzels, when a shadow fell across them. 3 men stood at the park's edge, their figures partially obscured by the mist. The tallest, a broad man with a shaved head and a scar across his cheek, locked eyes with Ethan. "That's her," he said to his companions, his voice low but carrying like a blade. Lily froze her pretzel, falling to the ground, her hand gripping Ethan's so tightly it hurt. Ethan stood, pulling Lily behind him. "Stay back," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "The man, Victor Kane." Ethan would later learn, smirked, stepping closer. "You've got our girl rich, man. She's got debts to pay." His companions, one with a tattooed neck and another with a limp, flanked him, their eyes fixed on Lily. She pressed herself against Ethan's leg, her breath hitching. "She's a child," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "She doesn't owe you anything." Victor laughed, a sound that grated against the quiet park. "You don't know how this works, do you? She's been on our streets, eating our food, taking up space. That comes with a price." Ethan's mind raced, calculating his options. He could call for help, but his phone was in his pocket, and any sudden move might escalate things. The park was empty, the drizzle keeping families away. He felt Lily trembling, her small hand clutching his sleeve, and something snapped into focus, a fierce protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. "Leave her alone," Ethan said, stepping forward, his height and presence cutting through the mist. "You come near her again and you'll regret it." Victor's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "Big words for a guy who hides behind money. We'll be back, Caldwell, and we'll take what's ours." They turned and melted into the fog, their footsteps fading. Ethan knelt, pulling Lily close. Her face was pale, her eyes brimming with tears. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They never do." He cupped her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "They won't touch you. I promise." But as they drove back to the mansion, Lily curled into the passenger seat. Ethan's promise felt fragile against the weight of her fear. Back at the estate, Ethan sat Lily down in the living room, where floor-to-ceiling windows framed the stormy Puget Sound. He handed her a mug of hot chocolate, watching as she sipped it slowly, her hands still shaking. "Who are they, Lily?" he asked gently. She stared into the mug, her voice barely above a whisper. "They made me beg for them, on the streets near the market. If I didn't bring enough money, they'd—" She trailed off, her fingers tracing the scar on her wrist. Ethan's throat tightened, rage mixing with a helplessness he wasn't used to. He wanted to press for more, to understand the full scope of what she'd endured, but her silence told him she wasn't ready. Instead, he changed tack. "You're safe here," he said, meaning it more than ever. "But I need to know everything so I can protect you." She nodded, her eyes distant, and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, tattered notebook. Its pages were filled with tiny handwriting quotes, fragments of stories, even bits of code she'd scribbled from the laptop. "I wrote things down," she said softly. "Things I heard them say, names, places, so I wouldn't forget." Ethan took the notebook, its weight heavier than its size suggested. Flipping through it, he saw names Victor Kane, Tommy Red, alongside addresses and phrases like "corner by the fish stall" and "don't let her run again." It was a child's attempt to make sense of chaos. A map of survival. "You're incredible," he said, his voice thick. Lily looked up, surprised, then ducked her head, a faint smile breaking through. That evening, Ethan called Rachel, asking her to cross-reference the names in Lily's notebook with police records. He also reached out to a private security firm, his tech instincts kicking in. He wasn't just protecting Lily. He was preparing for a fight he hadn't chosen, but couldn't avoid. As night fell, Ethan sat in his study, Lily's notebook open on his desk. The rain tapped against the windows, a reminder of the storm that had brought her to him. He thought of Emily again, of the sister he'd failed to save, of the years he'd spent building an empire to drown out the guilt. Lily wasn't Emily, but her presence was forcing him to confront the same questions he'd avoided for decades. What did it mean to care for someone? To be responsible for them? He didn't have answers, but he knew one thing: he couldn't let Lily face her shadows alone. Down the hall, Lily slept fitfully. Her notebook's secrets now shared her small frame, curled under blankets. The mansion, once a sterile monument, was beginning to feel like something else, a place where trust could grow, where wounds could heal, even if the shadows from the past were still circling, waiting for their chance to strike. The Seattle rain had given way to a heavy fog by the end of Lily Harper's first month in Ethan Caldwell's mansion, cloaking the city in a ghostly veil that seemed to mirror the tension building within its walls. The Queen Anne estate, once a silent fortress of glass and steel, now hummed with the small, persistent signs of life. Lily's laughter as she solved a coding puzzle, the clink of dishes as she helped Ethan stack the dishwasher, the faint scratch of her pencil as she scribbled in her tattered notebook. At 8 years old, Lily was a paradox, a child who carried the weight of a cruel past, yet lit up the rooms she entered with a curiosity Ethan found both disarming and inspiring. He'd watched her transform from the trembling girl who'd begged to sleep in his garage to someone who dared to smile, to ask questions, to trust, however tentatively, that she might belong here. But the shadows from her past, embodied by Victor Kane and his crew, loomed larger with each passing day, their threat a dark undercurrent beneath the fragile calm Ethan and Lily had built. Ethan had tightened security around the estate, installing motion sensors and hiring a discreet team to monitor the perimeter. He'd also grown closer to Lily, teaching her basic coding on his old laptop, marveling at how quickly she grasped concepts that had taken him years in college. She'd even written a simple program to animate a pixelated version of Mr. Paws, her ragged teddy bear bouncing across the screen. "It's for you," she'd said shyly, her eyes as bright with pride. Those moments made Ethan feel something he hadn't in years. A sense of purpose beyond boardrooms and algorithms. But the fear in Lily's eyes, whenever a car slowed outside or a door slammed too loudly, reminded him that safety was an illusion until Victor and his men were dealt with. Her nightmares had grown more vivid, her cries in the night now laced with names: Victor, Tommy. read the men from her notebook, the ones who'd forced her to beg on Seattle's streets. Ethan had shared the notebook with Rachel Nguyen, the social worker who'd confirmed that Victor Kane was a known figure in Tacoma's underbelly, linked to a network that exploited runaways. "They're dangerous," Rachel had warned, her voice tight. "You can't handle this alone, Ethan." Ethan wanted to believe he could protect Lily within the walls of his mansion. But the world outside was closing in. On a chilly Tuesday morning, Rachel insisted on taking Lily for a routine medical checkup at a clinic in downtown Seattle. Ethan hesitated, his instincts screaming to keep her close, but Lily, eager for a taste of normalcy, tugged at his sleeve. "It's just a doctor, Mr. Ethan," she said, her smile small but brave. "I'll be fine." Rachel promised to stay with her, and Ethan relented, watching their car disappear into the fog with a knot in his stomach. He spent the day in meetings, his mind only half present, as he reviewed contracts for his company's latest AI project. By late afternoon, his phone buzzed with Rachel's number, and her trembling voice shattered his focus. "Ethan, they took her. They took Lily." The words were a blade cutting through his carefully constructed world. Rachel's sobs filled the line as she explained 3 men had ambushed them outside the clinic, one pressing a note into her hand, while the others dragged Lily into a black van. The note, now crumpled in Rachel's shaking fingers, demanded $100,000 to be delivered to a warehouse in Portland by midnight, or Lily would disappear forever. They knew Ethan's name, his address, his wealth. "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. "I tried to stop them." Ethan's vision tunneled, rage and fear colliding in his chest. He told Rachel to stay put, and hung up, his hands steady, despite the storm inside him. He called his security team, instructing them to trace the van's plates from traffic cameras, but he knew time was against him. His younger brother Nathan, a corporate lawyer who'd flown in from New York for a visit, overheard the call and grabbed his arm. "You can't go after them alone, Ethan. Call the police. This is bigger than you." Ethan shook his head, his jaw tight. "If I involve the cops, they'll vanish with her. I won't risk that." Nathan's eyes, so like their late sister Emily's, flashed with frustration. "You're not a hero, Ethan. You're a tech guy. Let the professionals handle it." But Ethan was already moving, pulling cash from a safe in his study, the bills stacking into a duffel bag. He didn't care about the money. It was just a means to an end. Lily's face, her wide eyes, her timid smile burned in his mind. He'd promised her safety, and he'd failed. By evening, Ethan was on the road to Portland, the duffel bag heavy in the passenger seat of his Tesla. The fog thickened as he crossed the state line, the highway lights blurring into streaks. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Warehouse 17, Port of Portland. Come alone." Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel, his mind racing through scenarios. He'd faced hostile takeovers, ruthless competitors, but this was different. This was personal. The warehouse district was a maze of rusting containers and abandoned buildings, the air sharp with salt and diesel. Ethan parked a block away, the duffel bag slung over his shoulder, and moved through the shadows, his heart pounding. The warehouse loomed ahead, its single flickering bulb casting jagged light across the cracked pavement. He stepped inside, the smell of damp concrete and oil hitting him like a wave. In the center of the cavernous space, Lily sat tied to a metal chair, her small frame dwarfed by the ropes binding her wrists. Her face was pale, streaked with dried tears, but her eyes lit up when they met his. "Mr. Ethan," she whispered, relief flooding her voice, despite her fear. Victor Kane stepped from the shadows, his scarred face twisting into a smirk. 2 men flanked him, Tommy with his tattooed neck and Red limping slightly, their eyes cold and calculating. "You brought the money," Caldwell Victor asked, his voice a low growl. Ethan tossed the duffel bag forward, its thud echoing in the silence. 80,000, he said, his tone steady. You get the rest when she's safe. Victor laughed, a sound that made Lily flinch. You think we're here to bargain? She's worth more than your cash. Pretty kid like her, she'll fetch a price on the market. The words twisted like a knife in Ethan's gut, his fists clenching at the thought of what they meant. Before Ethan could respond, Lily's voice cut through the tension, small but sharp. You can't sell me, Victor. Her tone was calm, almost defiant, and every head turned toward her. She sat straighter, her eyes locked on Victor's. I know who you are. Victor Kane, you live in that gray house on Pine Street in Tacoma. You've got a brother who works at the docks. Doesn't he, Tommy? You're from Spokane, and your girlfriend's name is Lisa. She doesn't know what you do, does she? The men froze, their confidence cracking. Lily's voice grew steadier, her words a weapon forged from memory. And Red, you've got a kid, a boy named Mikey. He's 6, goes to Lincoln Elementary. I heard you talking about him when you thought I wasn't listening. Ethan stared, stunned by her courage. She'd taken the fragments of their conversations overheard during her months on the streets and turned them into a shield. Victor's face darkened, rage flickering in his eyes. Shut her up, he snarled, but his voice betrayed a flicker of fear. Ethan seized the moment, stepping closer, his presence towering. Let her go! Now! His voice was steel, but inside his heart raced. He could hear distant sirens, faint but growing louder. Rachel, against his orders, had called the police. Victor's eyes darted toward the sound, his smirk gone. This isn't over, Caldwell, he spat, cutting the ropes from Lily's wrists with a knife. The men bolted for a back exit, their footsteps echoing as they disappeared into the night. Ethan rushed to Lily, pulling her into his arms. She clung to him, her small body shaking, but unbroken. I knew you'd come, she whispered, her voice muffled against his chest. He held her tightly, his throat burning. I'll always come for you, he said the words, a vow he hadn't known he'd make. The police arrived minutes later, their flashlights sweeping the empty warehouse. Ethan and Lily sat on the cold floor, the duffel bag untouched beside them. Rachel ran in her face, streaked with tears, apologizing over and over. Ethan waved her off, his focus on Lily, who still gripped his sleeve as if afraid he'd vanish. The officers took statements, but Victor and his men were gone, swallowed by the Portland night. Ethan knew they'd return, their kind always did, but for now, Lily was safe. As they drove back to Seattle, Lily fell asleep against his side, her breathing steady for the first time in hours. Ethan glanced at her, her face softened in sleep, and felt a clarity he'd never known. This wasn't just about protection anymore. It was about fighting for her and for the life she deserved. The sirens had faded, but the battle was far from over. Victor's threat echoed in his mind, a reminder that the shadows would keep circling until he found a way to stop them for good. Back at the mansion, Ethan tucked Lily into bed, her small hand still clutching Mr. Paws. She stirred her eyes, half open. I tried to be brave, she murmured. You were braver than anyone, Ethan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. As he closed the door, he leaned against the wall, his resolve hardening. He'd spent his life building systems to solve problems, but this was different. Lily wasn't a puzzle to be solved. She was a person, a child, who'd trusted him with her life. And he would fight for her no matter what it took. The fog outside pressed against the windows, but inside a spark of light held strong a bond forged in the dark, one that Ethan knew would change him forever. 6 months had passed since the harrowing night in the Portland warehouse, and the Caldwell estate in Seattle's Queen Anne neighborhood had transformed from a sterile monument of glass and steel into something softer, something alive. The once silent halls now echoed with the sounds of Lily Harper's presence, her laughter as she raced through the living room, the tap of her fingers on a keyboard, the quiet hum of a song she sang to her teddy bear Mr. Paws when she thought no one was listening. At 8 years old, Lily had grown into herself, her cheeks carrying a healthy glow, her dark hair falling in soft waves, and her eyes, once shadowed with fear, now sparkling with a confidence that made Ethan Caldwell's heart ache with pride. The billionaire tech mogul, now 42, had spent decades building an empire of algorithms and innovation, but it was Lily who had rewritten the code of his life. The mansion, once a showcase of his success, was now a home, its walls softened by signs of her colored pencils scattered on the coffee table, a soccer ball resting by the garden door, and a small framed drawing of a pixelated Mr. Paws taped to the refrigerator. Yet the shadows of Lily's past, embodied by Victor Kane and his crew, still lingered in Ethan's mind. A reminder that safety was a fragile gift, one he was determined to protect at all costs. The morning of the adoption hearing in Seattle's King County Courthouse was crisp, the autumn sun casting golden light across the city's skyline. Ethan stood before the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting a navy tie with hands that trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from anticipation. Today, Lily would become his daughter, not just in his heart, but in the eyes of the law. He'd spent the past months navigating a labyrinth of legal processes, guided by Rachel Nguyen, the social worker, whose steady presence had become a quiet anchor for both him and Lily. The journey hadn't been easy, paperwork, home visits, and pointed questions about why a single billionaire with no parenting experience wanted to adopt a child from the streets. But Ethan had been resolute, his answers grounded in a truth he hadn't fully understood. Until Lily, he wasn't just saving her. She was saving him, giving him a purpose beyond wealth and power. As he straightened his jacket, Lily burst into the room. Her pale blue dress, the one she'd chosen with wide-eyed wonder during a shopping trip months ago, flaring as she spun. "Do I look okay, Mr. Ethan?" she asked, her voice bright but edged with nervousness. He knelt to meet her eyes, smiling. "You look perfect, Lily. Absolutely perfect." The courthouse was a grand, imposing building, its marble columns and high ceilings intimidating to most. But Lily walked beside Ethan with a quiet confidence, her hand tucked in his. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a woman with gray hair and a kind but discerning gaze, listened as Rachel presented Lily's case, her years in foster care, the abuse at the Tacoma orphanage, her escape, and the life she'd begun to build with Ethan. When it was Lily's turn to speak, she stood her small frame steady, despite the weight of the moment. "Where do you want to live, Lily?" the judge asked, her voice gentle. Lily didn't hesitate. "With Mr. Ethan," she said, her voice clear. "With my dad." The word hung in the air, fragile yet powerful, and Ethan felt his throat tighten. He blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill for the first time in decades. The judge smiled, her pen pausing over the papers. "I see a family here," she said, and within the hour, the adoption was finalized. Ethan clutched the signed documents, their weight heavier than any contract he'd ever held. This wasn't business, this was belonging. As they stepped outside, the Seattle sky stretched wide and clear, the distant outline of Mount Rainier sharp against the horizon. Ethan's younger brother Nathan waited on the courthouse steps, his usual polished demeanor softened by a rare smile. Months ago, he'd been furious, warning Ethan of the risks to their family's reputation, the potential for scandal. A child from the streets, he'd said, his voice sharp. "You're inviting chaos." But Nathan had seen the change in his brother, the way Ethan's late nights in the office had given way to evenings teaching Lily to code, reading her stories, or simply listening as she described her day. He'd seen Lily's transformation, too, from a wary, trembling girl to one who laughed freely, who challenged Ethan to soccer matches in the garden and left sticky notes with smiley faces on his desk. Now, Nathan bent to hug Lily, his voice low. "You're a Caldwell now," he said, and for the first time, he meant it. Lily beamed, clutching Ethan's hand, and in that moment, the weight of the past 6 months, the fear, the fight, the uncertainty seemed to lift, if only for a while. Back at the mansion, the changes were undeniable. The sterile perfection Ethan had once prized was gone, replaced by a warmth that felt more like home than he'd ever thought possible. Books were piled on tables, their pages dog-eared from Lily's eager reading. A small easel stood in the living room, covered with her drawings, bright, chaotic sketches of stars, trees, and a stick figure, Ethan holding her hand. He'd even bought a small desk for her where she spent hours coding simple programs, her talent for it growing under his guidance. Ethan had always been a problem solver, his mind wired for systems and solutions, but with Lily, he was learning to navigate something messier, something human. He'd begun to share stories of his own childhood, carefully at first about growing up with Emily, his sister who'd died in a car accident at 9. Those stories, once locked away, now flowed more easily, as if Lily's presence had cracked open a door he'd kept shut for years. But Ethan's vision stretched beyond the walls of his home. The night in Portland had shown him a truth he couldn't ignore. There were countless other children like Lily, lost in a world that offered them no shelter. Inspired by her resilience, he founded Lily's Lighthouse, a nonprofit dedicated to providing safe havens for street children across the Pacific Northwest. The first center opened in Tacoma. Not far from the orphanage Lily had fled, a modern facility with warm beds, classrooms, and a computer lab where kids could learn to code. Lily, now a frequent visitor, had helped design a simple app to teach basic programming, her eyes lighting up as she showed other children how to make a pixelated star dance across a screen. "It's like giving them magic," she'd told Ethan, her voice filled with wonder. At the center's inauguration, she stood beside him, her small hand in his, as they cut the ribbon. The crowd's applause faded beneath her whisper. "We're helping them, aren't we?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "Because you showed me how." Life at the estate settled into a rhythm that felt sacred. Evenings were spent in the garden where Lily kicked her soccer ball or planted flowers in neat rows, her hands no longer trembling with the fear of hunger. Rachel often joined them, her friendship with Ethan deepening into something neither quite named, but both felt growing. She'd become a partner in Lily's Lighthouse, her expertise shaping its programs, her warmth a steady presence in their lives. One quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the Puget Sound, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Lily tugged Ethan's hand and led him to a corner of the garden. There, where she'd once hidden from the storm, stood a small wooden structure, a miniature house built from cedar planks and painted white. Its roof slanted against the rain. Lily had worked on it with Rachel's help, her small hands sanding the wood, her focus unwavering. A plaque on its side read, "For every child who dreams of a home." Ethan knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders, his voice catching. "You asked for a garage once," he said softly. Lily nodded, her eyes shining. "But you gave me a home." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "No, Lily. You gave me one. You gave me family." The moment stretched, the sound of waves in the distance blending with the rustle of leaves. Ethan realized the storm that had brought Lily to his doorstep wasn't a curse, but a gift. It had shattered the walls of his solitude, filling his life with laughter, purpose, and a love he hadn't dared hope for. The mansion was no longer a billionaire's showcase. It was a home, a place where a child's courage had rewritten everything. Sometimes they'd sit together in the garden, Lily nestled against his side, and she'd ask him to tell the story of that first night, the rain, the plea, the open door. He'd tell it not as a tale of rescue, but as the moment his life truly began. "You were so brave," he'd say, and she'd smile, her fingers tracing the scar on her wrist, a reminder of the shadows she'd outrun. Lily's lighthouse grew its centers, spreading to Portland and Spokane, each one a beacon for children who'd known too much darkness. Ethan, once driven by ambition, found himself rediscovering a dream he'd buried long ago: to teach, to guide, to make a difference. He'd wanted to be a teacher before wealth and grief had pulled him elsewhere, and now through Lily and the children she inspired, he was living that dream. Lily, too, was finding her place. She'd started school, her backpack filled with books, and a laptop Ethan had bought her, her coding skills earning her quiet admiration from teachers. But more than that, she carried a certainty that hadn't been there before: the knowledge that she belonged, that she was loved, that no one could take her away. As the stars pierced the evening sky, Ethan and Lily sat on the garden bench, the small wooden house glowing faintly under the moonlight. The Puget Sound stretched endlessly before them, its waves a quiet promise of continuity. Ethan looked at Lily, her face calm and content, and felt a clarity he'd never known. This was family, not just a word but a choice, a bond forged through storms and shadows. He'd fought for her not just against Victor Kane, but against his own fears, his own past. And she'd fought too, with a courage that humbled him. Together, they'd built something greater than themselves: a home, a legacy, a light for others. Sometimes Ethan thought love doesn't arrive in grand gestures or perfect plans. Sometimes it begins with a child standing in the rain asking for a corner to call her own, and a man brave enough to open the door.